You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Hi, I'm Dr. Pamela Kreiser, and welcome back to NCR 507, which is our course in Research Design and Interpretation. Now, today we're going to continue to lay the foundation for research methods. We're going to talk about some important basics to make sure we understand them. We'll start with the independent and dependent variable. Then we'll talk about ethics, the IRB, and human subjects. And finally, we'll end our discussion talking about research questions and hypotheses. So let's start by talking about the very important independent and dependent variables. These are important because they help us understand what goes into actually the construction of a research design. So this first video I want to show you covers the basics of the independent and the dependent variable. Let's take a look. Today we are going to talk about independent and dependent variables. The focus will be on understanding how these operate in research and also being able to identify these variables in research projects. To keep it simple, we will use examples that have just one independent variable and one dependent variable, even though sometimes research projects involve many variables. Let's start with dependent variables. In research, the dependent variable is highly important because this is the variable the researcher is trying to explain or predict. Often, the dependent variable is associated with the purpose of the study or the focus of the research project. The dependent variable is thought to be dependent or be influenced by other variables in the study. The researcher measures the changes on the dependent variable because of this dependency. In research, the independent variable is also important because this is the variable that the researcher manipulates. This is the variable that does the influencing. Some examples will help us understand these two variables. Let's start by looking at examples of how the independent variable and the dependent variable operate in difference testing. Let's say we were conducting a study with the following two-tailed hypothesis. Adults and children will differ significantly in the total number of calories they consume per day. By definition, we know that a hypothesis expresses the researcher's prediction about the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. So we can identify the presence of each variable by looking at the hypothesis. The dependent variable is the total calorie consumption per day. The independent variable is the age group, and there are two levels of this age group, adults and children. This is a two-tailed hypothesis because of the word differ. And this indicates the researcher's belief that the groups will be significantly different, but it does not specify which group will be higher or lower. In other words, it could go either way, or either of the two ways, so it is called two-tailed. Going back to our diagram, we can see how the independent variable age group explains and predicts the dependent variable consumption of calories per day. Here is another example to help us understand the independent and dependent variable. In this hypothesis, the researcher is conducting a study about the fear of violent crime. The researcher predicts a one-tailed hypothesis. Individuals who watch violent film will report significantly higher fear of violent crime than those who watch non-violent films. The dependent variable is fear of violent crime. The independent variable is film exposure, and there are two types, or two treatments. One is a violent film and the other is a non-violent film. Going back to our diagram, we can see how the independent variable, film exposure, explains and predicts the dependent variable, reported fear of violent crime. Of course, these examples raise important questions about measurement. We identified our dependent variable as the reported fear of violent crime. The researcher would have to determine how to measure this dependent variable. This could be done in any number of ways. The researcher might have the individuals complete a survey where the subject indicates their reported level of fear, or the researcher might find some other way to measure fear. The researcher would also have to manipulate the independent variable. This is where the researcher would manipulate, which means to handle or control, the subjects into two groups, those who watch violent films and those who do not. If a researcher was conducting an experiment the researcher could decide to show subjects these films, or perhaps the researcher would be conducting a survey and the researcher might have subjects identify their levels of exposure to watching violent films and then put them into two groups, the violent film exposure group and the non-violent film exposure group. Notice that these are not two independent variables, but two groups that are within the single independent variable called film exposure. The decision about measuring the dependent variable and the grouping of the independent variable will be left up to the researcher. So far in this video, we've identified two examples of difference tests. First, we looked at differences between adults and children in their calorie consumption per day. And in the second example, we looked at differences reported in fear of violent crime according to violent film and non-violent film exposure. Notice that in both of these examples of difference testing, there was the presence of a categorical independent variable. By this, we mean the researcher manipulated the independent variable by forming groups. For difference testing, this makes sense because if you're looking for differences in the dependent variable, you would have to compare groups to find that difference. Now let's turn our focus to relationship testing. Let's review two more examples of independent variables and dependent variables and how they operate. Even though this is a relationship test, our initial diagram has not changed. We are still looking at the independent variable and dependent variable in terms of explaining and/or predicting. Here's the one-tailed hypothesis. Study hours will be a significant and positive predictor of test performance. Here we observe that the dependent variable is test performance and the independent variable is study hours. We have a one-tailed hypothesis because it specifically makes a positive prediction. One question you might be wondering about is the differentiation between the words explain and predict. The answer is that sometimes we are interested in explaining variables and sometimes we are interested in predicting them. It will depend on a variety of factors, including your conclusions from the literature review, your confidence in previously reported results, the data levels you collect, and the particular test that you intend to run on the data. For this second example, we'll be looking at another relationship test, our last hypothesis. Reported hours of sleep will be significantly and positively related to reported levels of happiness. You will notice that this particular hypothesis uses the word related. In this example, we're looking at a correlation. Consequently, it is not as important to identify the variable that's the independent variable and which one is the dependent variable. Keep in mind that because this is a correlation, we are not able to determine a causal relationship. We only predict that they are positively related. Remember that correlation does not equal causation. Our options are to predict that they are positively related, negatively related, or possibly unrelated. In our specific example, we believe that they are positively related, but there are no identified causes. We don't know that sleep makes an individual happier or that happier individuals sleep. We only know that they tend to move together as variables. So we predict that they are positively related, or in our case, positively correlated. This means that when one variable goes up, the other tends to go up, and vice versa. When one variable goes down, the other tends to go down. They move together. In this example, we can only explain how the variables are or are not related to each other. This is why we call this type of inquiry a relationship test. In review, we have seen how independent and dependent variables might operate in both the context of difference testing as well as in relationship testing. Overall, we know that understanding this basic information leads to strong foundations in research.
The next part of the show is where we're going to talk about ethics. And as we talk about ethics, we want to go through two different examples, the Tuskegee syphilis study and also the infamous Milgram experiments. These are both examples of atrocities that really have been committed in terms of ethics violations. So we're going to examine both of them to start thinking about the question of ethics and what our responsibilities are as a researcher. So let's start with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Basically what went on in that study, it ran from 1932 to 1972, and it was a study where they took 399 men and put them into the study and told them that they had bad blood so that they would be able to watch the progression of syphilis. So let's take a look at the basics of this experiment and understand what was going on at that time.
It was in 1932 that Lily Head's father Freddie was approached by a doctor from the US Public Health Service. He was working as a sharecropper in the small town of Tuskegee in Alabama.
They came and told him that he had what they called bad blood, quotation mark, bad blood. So my father, being a conscientious person and health conscious, felt that the story that they were telling him, if you have the bad blood, we can work with you and we will help you to control it. So he joined up, as many of the men did. They felt that was a, pretty good deal. Here they were poor, uneducated, and you had professionals, the doctors, whom they felt were responsible and liable, and they had placed all their trust in them. They were looking to better their health and to better their conditions with.
But the doctors from the Public Health Service had no intention of helping the men get better. They didn't even explain that bad blood was actually the sexually transmitted disease of syphilis. Without their knowledge, the men were being enlisted in a medical study under the title Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male, to see what happened if syphilis sufferers were given no treatment for their illness.
They would visit the men, check their blood, and then after each test, the men were given lunch and they were told, if things were going well or if things wasn't going well, but which wasn't quite factual.
So they knew that they were involved in a medical study, they just didn't know what it was.
I don't know if they would have understood it as a medical study, but they knew that they were being tested because their blood was supposed to have been bad. There was just so much information that was not available to them, and they were not informed.
Doctors already knew in 1932 that if syphilis is left untreated, it can cause heart disease, strokes, dementia, or even death. But in Tuskegee, there was very little public knowledge or discussion of the disease.
As you can see, this study is terribly problematic and resulted in all kinds of harm. We need to review these kinds of cases to understand what important ethics standards are for researchers. So you can see in this study, 399 men who were misled to participate in this kind of a study, and then they were actually further misled on each of the times that they were checked. Now, you can think about the dates of this study. It began in 1932 and went on to 1972. But think about it. In 1947, the drug of choice became penicillin. So that means that for most of this study, penicillin was actually the treatment, and it was a very effective treatment for syphilis, but it was withheld from the men. Their justification was to try to understand syphilis. The result, human harm and terrible deception. So as this study went on in 1972, you would be tempted to think, oh, this is when people woke up and realized they were doing the wrong thing. But that's actually not what happened. In this US Public Health Organization, which by the way is the predecessor to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, the government workers were basically overlooking this. I don't know how many people saw this file and didn't act on it, but it should alarm all of us in terms of the idea that people knew what was going on and didn't say anything. Well, that's where Peter Buxton comes in. He was working for the US Public Health Organization, and he came across it and said, we shouldn't be doing this. People didn't respond, so he went to the press. And ultimately, Peter Buxton was the one who's credited for stopping this experiment. Sadly, it did go on for that 40-year period, and it took Peter Buxton's bravery to actually get it to be discontinued. So we think about that example and we think, wow, that gives us a lot of insight into what was going on during that time period, and that people who are researchers need to keep their motives in check, that we need to make sure that harm is not something that we're doing to other people. And you can see that this resulted, when we get to it, into some important laws that govern our research projects today. So when we think about this project and we understand that cover-ups happen, it was only in 1997 that the government finally admitted fault, and you can hear the apology of Bill Clinton right here.
The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It was an outrage to our commitment to integrity and equality for all our citizens. To the survivors, to the wives and family members, the children and the grandchildren, I say what you know. No power on earth can give you back the lives lost, the pain suffered, the years of internal torment and anguish. What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry.
Well, this apology started the healing process. Of course, it's not enough. So that's why we bring it up in a course like this, to make sure that we have the memory of the wrongdoing so that we can try to at least reduce future harm. There's so many parts to the study that are very troubling. I find it very troubling that these participants were uneducated, so therefore untrained or unable to decipher the deception that was going on. They were poor. And this idea that we would use either of those populations to advance research is really a horrible example. And so a reminder then to us on how to conduct our research. Now, the second example that I want to go over is the infamous Milgram experiments. And you might be familiar with this experiment series. These were experiments done out of Yale, and Stanley Milgram was interested basically in social influence. He was interested in the idea of why people might obey and wanted to study it. But again, we see some very big issues regarding harm because there weren't any rules. Let's take a look at this basic experiment.
Stanley Milgram, one of the most influential social psychologists of the time, was particularly fascinated with the dangers of group behavior and blind obedience to authority.
What is there in human nature that allows an individual to act without any restraints whatsoever, so that he can act inhumanely, harshly, severely, and in no way limited by feelings of compassion or conscience? These are questions.
So Stanley Milgram was basically looking for the idea that exploring the idea of why people do obey other people's commands. So he did these famous Milgram experiments. Now this was in 1962, again prior to the rules that we have today, and you'll definitely see why. So his experiment was to recruit 40 participants, and he called them participants. They were white males, and that was who was invited to participate at that time period in our history. And so the idea was that they would come in and work with this tool that he created called the shock generator. And the shock generator would deliver supposedly a shock to anyone who had a wrong answer on the experiment that they were conducting. So let's review the shock generator.
In 1962, Stanley Milgram shocked the world with his study on obedience. To test his theories, he invented an event that would become a window into human cruelty. In ascending order, a row of buttons marked the amount of voltage one person would inflict upon another. Milgram's original motive for the experiment was to understand the unthinkable, how the German people could permit the extermination of the Jews.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University. It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn. All right, now the next thing we'll have to do is set the learner up so that he can get some sort of punishment.
What inspired Milgram, I would say there were a number of factors. One of them is he was very ambitious. He wanted to make a mark in social psychology. And he wanted, as he wrote to one friend, he wanted to come up with the boldest experiment that he could think of.
Would you roll up your right sleeve, please? This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room. And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn. Do you have any questions now before we go into the next room?
About 2 years ago, I was at the Veterans Hospital in West Haven. And while there, they detected a heart condition. There's nothing serious, but as long as I'm having these shocks, how strong are they? How dangerous are they?
Well, no, although they may be painful, they're not dangerous. Anything else?
No, that's all.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator.
Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts, and you increase the shock one step on each error.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105. Hard hit. Just how far can you go in this thing? As far as is necessary. What do you mean as far as is necessary?
Milgram was very much aware that obedience is a necessary ingredient for society to function. But he focused on the darker side of obedience.
Incorrect. 150 volts. Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now.
It's absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice, teacher.
Oh, I have a lot of choices. My number one choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Now, this man makes disobedience seem a very rational and simple deed. Now, other subjects respond quite differently to the experimenter's authority.
Wrong. It's hair.
As you can see from the Milgram experiment, this caused a lot of psychological distress for those who were delivering the supposed shocks. Of course, the experiment's rigged, but the people delivering the shocks don't realize this. Now, what's important to know about 1962 is that we didn't have the term debriefing at that time. So if you can imagine the individuals who participated in this experiment, the Milgram experiment, delivered the shocks and then simply just went home, not knowing whether they injured somebody, killed somebody, did any kind of harm. They had no real sense of the impact of this experiment because they weren't, again, required. So this era of research without rules, you can see really affected the types of rules that went on in the actual experiments. So since there was no debriefing, there was actually the potential for these participants to wonder about it even for many years. So let's take a look at this next clip regarding one of the experiment shock deliverers many years after the experiment and his thoughts.
Increasing frustration, so did I. And I was really in a state of real conflict and agitation. One of Stanley Milgram's basic contributions was that you don't ask people what they would do given this hypothetical situation, you put them in the situation.
Wrong. I want the 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
180 volts. Can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man there.
According to Milgram, one of the things that's a prerequisite for carrying out acts that are evil is to shed responsibility from your shoulders and hand it over to the person in charge.
I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
Next one, slow.
He didn't hold any gun to anybody's head. Just the fact that he conveyed a sense of authority. Roughly 60-65% of the people went all the way to the top of the shock board.
450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer. Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we
But
must...
he might be dead in there.
Milgram made the point, I think very effectively, that the Nazis weren't all a bunch of psychopaths at Belsen and Dachau. A death camp from the middle class in New Haven.
Well, who was actually pushing the switch?
I was. But he kept insisting. I told him no, but he said it's got to keep going.
What kind of a...
You can imagine the distress that was placed on these people delivering the supposed shocks. So all of these examples, the Tuskegee example, the Milgram experiments, and there's so many more examples in your book that talk about these ethics violations, well, that ended up collectively needing to have a response. And so finally, in 1974, we established the National Research Act. And this was our first effort into trying to get some rules in place for the experiments and studies being conducted in the United States. So we started with that, and then that evolved into the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report was in 1979, and this is when we started to get some details about some of the rules that needed to be in place or that were now required of researchers. So we started talking about this notion of human subjects. And before that, we would just call them subjects. So this report reminded us of the humans that were involved and spoke about reducing harm or eliminating harm. It also talked about the need for disclosure, so it speaks specifically about deception and the idea that we need to debrief our participants in our studies. And then it also established that we need to have informed consent. And that means that we can't just do these experiments without getting full consent for people to know the risk or possible risk that they're engaging in by participating in our study. So that ended up becoming what the rule is that we have today. And today we have something called the Common Rule, which is sort of the nickname for the collective rules that are in place. And at most institutions, you find also something called an IRB. And that's an institutional review board. And this IRB is found at most colleges and universities, some other institutions, and it's the board that reviews the research before it is conducted. Remember, previous to this, we didn't have those rules. So these are the qualifiers for you to be able to conduct research. Now, as you're listening to this show, you might say, oh, I'm not doing research right now, so it doesn't really apply to me. Well, I think it does apply to you in that you might participate in a study, and later in your career, you might decide to conduct a study. So it's important to be aware that permission needs to be granted from the appropriate institution or board in that institution. And if you were at a college or university, you would use that IRB. So now that we've taken a look at the ethics topic and the human subjects and the IRB, I want to move our discussion now to research questions and hypotheses. And so as we talk about this concept, we're talking about hypotheses where we make a prediction or research questions where we ask questions. And this next video kind of goes through the two types of research questions and two types of hypotheses that a researcher might use in his or her study. Let's take a look.
After you have completed your review of literature, you will need to determine your research questions and/or hypotheses. This decision depends on which variables you are intending to measure, as well as what you want to know about those variables based on your research. Given the research, are you asking a question about a variable or are you making a prediction? As you make this decision, you will notice that research questions and hypotheses differ in their structure as well as their level of prediction. The first dimension is structure. Very simply, a research question is phrased as a question. A hypothesis is phrased as a statement. The second dimension is prediction. Are you making a prediction, yes or no? Now that we know about structure and prediction, let's examine all four of these options. Two types of research questions and two types of hypotheses used in research. First, let's discuss research questions. There are two types of research questions, directional and non-directional. Both are phrased as questions. A directional research question makes a prediction, while a non-directional research question does not. An example will help us understand the difference between these two types. Directional research questions sound like this. Are children significantly more talkative than adults? Here you can see the directionality is predicted in how the question is phrased. The question phrasing reflects the researcher's guess that children will be more talkative. The word more makes this apparent. A non-directional research question might sound like this. Will children and adults differ significantly in their talkativity? You can see that in a non-directional research question, there is no directionality indicated. The question phrasing reflects the researcher's openness to either group being more or less talkative. The word differ makes this apparent. Now let's discuss hypotheses. There are two types of hypotheses, one-tailed and two-tailed. Both are phrased as statements. A one-tailed hypothesis makes a specific prediction, while a two-tailed hypothesis makes a prediction but not a specific one. An example will help us understand the difference between these two types. A one-tailed hypothesis sounds like this. Children will be significantly more talkative than adults. Here you can see directionality is predicted in how the hypothesis is phrased. The hypothesis phrasing reflects the researcher's prediction that children will be more talkative. The word more makes this apparent. A two-tailed hypothesis sounds like this. Children and adults will differ significantly in their talkativity. You can also see that in the two-tailed hypothesis, there is not a specific directionality indicated. There is a predicted difference, but it doesn't specify which group will be higher or lower. The word differ makes this apparent. As we put this together, we can see that all four types can be differentiated by looking at structure as well as the specificity of the prediction. Let's review a few examples to make sure we can identify each of the four types. Example number 1. Married individuals will engage in conflict significantly less frequently than those not married. What is this? First, you look at the structure and you notice it is a statement and therefore determine it is a hypothesis. Second, you examine the prediction and you notice it does make a prediction using the word less, and it is therefore a one-tailed hypothesis. Example number 2. Will married individuals engage in conflict significantly more often than those not married? What is the answer? First, you look at the structure and you notice it is a question and therefore determine it is a research question. Second, you examine whether it predicts and you notice it does make a prediction using the word more. Therefore, it is a directional research question. Example number 3. Students will differ significantly in the number of questions they ask compared to teachers. What type is this? First, you look at the structure and you notice it is a statement and therefore determine it is a hypothesis. Second, you examine whether it predicts and you notice it does not make a specific prediction. It is therefore a two-tailed hypothesis. Example number 4. Will students differ significantly in their frequency of asking questions compared to teachers? What is the answer? First, you look at the structure and you notice it is phrased as a question. Second, you examine whether it predicts and you notice it does not make a prediction and is therefore a non-directional research question. So now we have seen how structure and prediction affect the types of hypotheses and research questions we can create. As you think about this topic from a broader perspective, we should briefly talk about how bold a researcher is willing to be. This is also a key part of deciding between a research question and a hypothesis. Very simply, do you have a good reason to make a prediction? This good reason will likely come from your review of literature that has preceded your inquiry. And as you construct your own research and also read the research of others, You will note this level of boldness, and then you can consider it.
As you can see in the video, we have a lot of decisions to make as researchers. So if you're feeling confident based on your review of literature, then you might make a prediction, or even a bolder prediction and make a one-tailed hypothesis. But on the other hand, you might do research and think, well, it could go either way, or it could be something that I'm not sure how it will turn out. And then you might have some very good reasons to ask a research question or two. But what's important is to make the connection between the research that exists and your decisions as a researcher. Overall, really how we think about research design and interpretation is to think about the idea that all of this has to be systematic. In other words, we don't just haphazardly do research anymore. What we do is we take special steps to make sure all of the different conditions are met, and we follow specific processes. So the next clip I want you to watch is of Dr. Claudia Lum, and she is a science educator, and she shares her thoughts about the scientific method. For the last part of this show, we want to bring on a special guest, Dr. Claudia Lum. And I've invited her onto the show because I want us to talk about this idea of the scientific method. She is a science educator, and we have her on Skype for our interview now. Claudia, welcome to our program.
Hi, Dr. Kreiser.
Glad to have you on board. So I know you do science education, and I know that that's a big part of your background. What we are hoping to talk about today is this idea of the scientific method, and to hear kind of from you some basics about it. So why don't we start with, what is the scientific method?
Sure. The scientific method is the systematic, unbiased approach for finding answers to questions that we have. It is our universal method that we use by social scientists and by our hard scientists to prove and disprove explanations, make generalizations, confirm theories, gain knowledge, and ultimately help us inform policy and practice. It's an extremely organized and rigorous process, and it's been done since the 17th century.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that the emphasis is on this organized, systematic process. I know that how it's implemented in hard sciences is a little bit different than social science, but the idea is that it's systematic. How does it work, like for our purposes, as we look at its implementation? Sure.
You know, it is very organized and orderly. So we usually start out with an observation or a set of observations that we notice about something. And scientists, sometimes they come in patterns, but it's something that's happening consistently over time. So for example, I'll take something that maybe people might know about in sciences, if you've had high school science. Pollinating 2 tall pea plants, right, seems to create more tall pea plants, okay? So that's an observation that we have made consistently over time, okay, if we were a scientist. Mm-hmm. Then the scientist would say, so I'm thinking that my hypothesis or educated guess about what is going on is that when we pollinate tall with tall, we're going to get tall pea plants. Mm-hmm. Okay, this sounds really simple right now, but just for people to understand what this is like. So then what the scientist does is he or she creates an experiment or does testing of some sort. It looks different in the social sciences to the hard sciences, but in this case, we're creating a set of experiments, and everything is extremely controlled, right? So the environment is controlled. There's no contamination. The plants, as you breed them, all of that process is controlled. There really are clean, careful guidelines for this process, strict measurements, same amount of water, same amount of time that we're pollinating during the plant growth process. you name it, the scientists control all the variables except for the growth of these plants, okay? And that's super rigorous. It's not to be taken lightly. This is an example with plants, but we use scientific method a lot, particularly in medicine, and the rigor gets even more complicated.
And it's complicated because of the controls, or?
Yeah, it's complicated because there are variables that you have to control, and letting in particular variables, right, causes potential errors that would skew the experiment. Okay.
So the more the other variables that could be involved, the more likely that error could be something that is worrisome to the researcher?
That's right, because then you're not testing what you're actually testing, your actual hypothesis. The hypothesis is super clear cut, and you don't want to have any other thing in the way of answering that particular question in an unbiased way.
Okay. So is that what I'm hearing when you talk about this idea of unbiased? Am I hearing that that's what you kind of get with the scientific method? That you, because it's so organized and systematic, is that how we get rid of the bias? Because I know that hard science and social science struggles with that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, and the social science is definitely a different beast, right? Because you're dealing with people. And but even if you think about like Dr. Jenner, remember when he was doing the cowpox and smallpox, and he was trying to determine, he kind of found a correlation between people who got cowpox and then those people did not get smallpox, right? And in that experiment, it turns out that at that time, I'm going to say maybe 1800s, the people were fairly homogeneous. They were not able to move within and around the area. There was no traveling, right? I mean, we're traveling on buggies, right? And diet was similar. There wasn't anything that was engineered.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to bring in all these sorts of variables that we have now when we really talk about controlling the variables so that bias does not occur to try to answer a question. That's a really good example, if you want to look at that later on, as to how it almost was perfect because it was such a long time ago. We didn't have all of those other things that we would have to account for now that would bias our study.
That's very interesting. So then one of the thoughts that occurs to me is in a mobile society, a society that has so much travel, so much ability to go all over the world, to see lots of different people, all these different things, that seems like all of a sudden, if we talk about bias, that we have, or lack of control, we have introduced all kinds of factors just on the baseline, so to speak.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you almost have to, it makes things more complicated, at least in the scientific field, it makes it more difficult. So more studies, creating a very randomized, controlled experiment, right? Again, I know you'll talk about this in your class, but just adds to the complexity of controlling the study. But it's not anything to be taken lightly, actually. When students do their research, it's really important that they really try to unbias their research at the testing level when they design their experiment or whatever they plan on doing, and at the analysis level, right? So there's multiple ways of creating error, but I know you'll get to that in your class.
Indeed.
You'll get to that in class.
So it's important because of that. Is that what you would say, that that's the primary contribution? Is that idea of control and getting the bias out, or do you believe there's something we're missing?
No, I mean, I do believe that's what we're trying to do, is controlling the variables so that when you do your study, you're only focused on one question.
So let's talk for a second about any other applications. We talked about some hard science examples. You and I have talked about some social science examples. Other thoughts that you would say we could talk about that are examples in our society that might be useful to see in the social science or in social programs?
Yeah, I definitely would love to talk to you about a program that probably a lot of people know, that was actually super successful, but turns out, and we spent a lot of money on it, but it ended up being a program that was wrought with some validity issues. So this is the DARE program.
Okay.
DARE stands for Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program. It was a large-scale program started in 1983, done in the upper elementary and middle schools with the LA Unified School District and LAPD Chief Daryl Gates. I don't know if you remember. It was a great program. It was a feel-good program. It was a noble program trying to prevent the use of controlled drugs, among other things, but among juveniles. And if you remember, there was the Just Say No. Students, what they would do is they signed a pledge saying that they were not going to use drugs or join gangs, because that was a part of the among other things. But it was particularly students will not use drugs. And the local police came and did a 10-week program with them, which to prep that took 80 hours of training for the police officer, 40 hours for the teacher, and at the end of the program, they collected data. Okay, so the whole idea, students weren't going to use drugs. And at the end of the program, they collected a survey and students weren't doing drugs. So this program was super successful. And it was so successful that Nancy Reagan even pushed for DARE in schools. Okay, I mean, I think this program probably lasted for almost 20 years. So, and this is why I say, why is scientific method so important? Why is the use of it so important? So, because it was so successful, actual scientific research using the scientific method, right, was done on DARE. And they use randomized controlled experiments, long-term studies, okay, to try to see, wow, what is it, right? Is this working, right? And wanting to record the data, okay, and wanting to get this out so we could get more policy, more money, more implementation. So there was tons of research done. Indiana University, 1992, that's when it started. California Department of Ed, 1995. The NIJ, National Institutes of Justice, 1998. The American Psychological Association, 1999. Unbelievable amount of research that was done, from long-term studies to just the randomized controlled experiments. They pulled so much research just on DARE. And it turns out that after all of this was done, every single report found that DARE was ineffective in reducing drug use. In fact, some of those studies of groups that I had mentioned to you before showed an increased likelihood of subjects to drink alcohol, smoke tobacco, and use illegal drugs. It was very interesting because one of the studies even found that by exposing impressionable children to drug use, it encouraged drug use.
Okay.
And who would have thought, you see?
Right.
So at the very end, over $200 to $700 million in total was spent on DARE over 20 plus years. I mean, in 2002 to 2010 is sort of when they started ratcheting it down, because the haphazard research that was going on, that had gone on because of DARE, right, was countered and fraught with problems, but found through the scientific method of the research that was done by these other groups. And they just found lots of issues with validity, reliability, bias, implementation bias. Some of the groups are counterproductive. Some of the populations that they tested were counterproductive in this whole process anyways, right? The population itself. How about gathering truth in front of the parents through surveys, right? That students weren't being honest about drug use.
Right.
So all of that the methodology was flawed, the analysis was flawed, and so at the very end, we spent so much money and so much time and effort for a program that didn't help at all. And the funny thing I think is interesting about all of this which is what scientists struggle with today and researchers, is even after we've disproved DARE, police, teachers, community leaders still promoted it. They still promoted it because in their heart and in small experiences, it helped. And so the funny thing is, even with this rigorous methodology, sometimes the research didn't even change the practice.
Yeah.
Which I think that is interesting that that I'm sure that you'll be talking about in your class too.
Yeah.
Because that is sometimes what researchers struggle to do now, is to take the findings of their unbiased research and bring it into practice.
So that
Right.
kind of leads me to a pretty interesting follow-up question, and that is, should we be introducing programs and immediately starting with scientific approaches, like scientific method analyses, very systematic examinations of these ideas before we put them into practice? I mean, which comes first? Like, I understand the idea of DARE, and it's a great idea, and we love the proposition behind it. My question is, how do we remedy that, I guess, looking back? Like, what have we learned?
I mean, a lot of times when we do scientific research, we do, I guess we call them, when I say observations, a lot of times those are practice go-arounds. Those are generalizations. Those are ideas that are sitting with us for a little while. It's not just one time that we find something, right? I mean, as scientists go through and find things about our world, those theories that they continue to either prove or maybe disprove, those are the same theories that we continually try to look at, right? And so those are theories for a reason. They've been around for a long time, right? And so they're called theories. In fact, sometimes we don't use the word facts because, there are things that are called facts, but theories can be changed. And so I feel in the same way, social science, don't you think? I think they made a generalization. They came up with an explanation, right, about something that happened, and then they used it to create a program. Well, I think it was too early.
It's interesting to me that we have this notion that, so they thought DARE was a great idea, then in retrospect do all the experiments to find out that it doesn't work, and then you're saying their bias, wanting to believe that it works, ends up their keeping of the program, which
Right.
is very, very interesting because it sort of invalidates both of the processes, the implementation originally and then also the accompanying scientific explanation, right? Which is, I find that kind of interesting because when we talk about bias in quantitative and these method areas, we often are tagging the researcher on that. But here we're kind of tagging like the public and the funding agents and the agencies to say their bias was so strong about this notion that it actually gave them lenses to where they couldn't see the results, so to speak?
Yeah, and that's interesting. Unfortunately, I think that happens a lot, and maybe for political reasons, maybe, like I said, because it's personal. People really got involved with DARE, and it was a personal experience. And how can police officers and teachers working together with kids not be a good thing? I mean, that, I think, in education, those kinds of things are positive things. But we can't step out and say, this causes this, unless we've done unbiased research.
Right. So then,
we can't.
Do we have that answer then? Do we have the answer to DARE now today in your knowledge? I don't have that knowledge, but have we figured out how to reduce drug use and reporting of drug use and saying no and all these different things? Have we solved that puzzle, Claudia?
I think there has been tons more research done in this area about juvenile drug abuse. I know that there's research out there. I'd have to look into it.
Yeah.
And certainly, but I do know that but better research has been done.
Right.
But I think, and it's also what we tell our kids too, when we're looking at the internet and they're studying about things, is what do you believe when you're reading something and you're trying to get non-biased information, right? Trying to get factual information. What do you believe when you see things on the internet? We still see all sorts of things that are controlled by political groups, that are controlled by groups that still believe in religious, could be, right? There's many different ways in which people run how they do things, right, in their lives. So, but as far as the research that you're talking about and what we want our students to do, when they do their own research, they have to know that this scientific method process is not haphazard. It is extremely organized, systematic. It's done the same way across the sciences and in all parts of the world, right? This is a universal methodology. It has multiple checks and balances. Students who do qualitative research will find that they're going to do multiple types of ways to gather data, multiple ways to analyze the data. It's just, I think the whole process, and in the end, it's based on how scientists think. So we use it because of that strength, and whatever we find helps to, as I heard someone say, define us, explain our world.
Yeah.
Right? Help us understand a little bit more, and maybe disprove what we once thought, like the world is not flat. Right?
Right.
So, but you got to follow the rules of engagement. That would be my last comment for you when you do scientific method research.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lum, for coming on the show today. We appreciate your input, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Oh, no, no problem. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Okay, have a great day.
Thank you.
So as you can see, there are systematic ways to go through our research. Now, in today's session, we've talked about some very important topics. We started by talking about the independent and dependent variable. Then we moved to our discussion of ethics, human subjects, and the IRB. And then finally, we ended with hypotheses and research questions and our review with Dr. Claudia Lum of the scientific method. Well, that about covers it for this show today. Thanks for tuning in. This is Dr. Pamela Kreiser, hoping your day is not just different, but significantly different.